Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for joining us again. Really appreciate it. My name is Stephen Noonoo. I'm the K12 editor here at EdSurge, and EdSurge is a news and information resource helping bring you the best in education technology through our news stories, our research programs, and our community activities, which include live conferences and events such as this webinar. And at the end of last year, EdSurge joined ISTE, the International Society for Technology and Education. And ISTE is a nonprofit organization that serves educators interested in the use of technology in education. So for today's webinar, we've lined up some really dynamic speakers on early learning and how that's impacting how remote learning is being impacted by that. As a quick note, before we begin, this webinar will be recorded and the recording will be made available to you via email after the live event. So if you've signed up for the webinar, you'll also receive updates about recurring webinars on this topic, which we plan to host weekly. So you can ask questions through the webinar using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll bring your questions into the discussion as we're able. So we'd also encourage you to use the chat to say hello and share some resources. But please do put those questions for the panel into the Q&A. If for any reason, we may have to disable the chat, if we have any unwelcome visitors, we apologize in advance for that. We haven't had any problems so far. But just keep that in mind. Before we get started, I just want to draw your attention to a new guide from EdSurge and ISTE. It's called Navigating Uncertain Times, How Schools Can Cope with Coronavirus, and it collects all of our stories, our contributors, and all the resources from these webinars. That's all there. It's really the page where we're collecting all the webinar recaps, and that's online at readiness.edsurge.com. And I also want to draw your attention to a new site from ISTE and a host of other education groups. It's called Learning Keeps Going, and it features tons of resources, including an educator help desk, and that's online at learningkeepsgoing.org. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panelists on today's call. I am, again, so honored that they could share their time and expertise with us on such short notice. Today, we're joined by Rhian Allvin. She's the Chief Executive Officer at the National Association for the Education of Young Children. We're joined by Katie Gardner, elementary English as a second language teacher at Knollwood Elementary in Salisbury, North Carolina. And last but not least, Gail Lovely, the founder of the ISTE Early Learning Professional Learning Network. So I have a few quick questions, and then we're going to move into taking your submitted questions. We won't be able to answer everything, but we'll, of course, be bringing on new speakers next week, and next week's topic is going to be social emotional learning, and so you won't want to miss that one. I'm going to start with a question, just a broad question. So how do you talk to kids that may be as young as 5 or 6 about the disruption that they're experiencing? And how do you talk to them about the health issues around the coronavirus? Rhian, can we start with you?
Sure. Thanks for having me this afternoon. In many instances, a public health crisis like this, it exemplifies advice and guidance that we give on a normal day, quite frankly. And so for children to know that they're loved, that they're cared for, that they're safe, that they're going to be taken care of, are all really important components of kind of how you manage in this situation. I think we're putting a lot on parents now who are, in some instances, working from home and are being parents at the same time. And so not putting too much pressure on parents around kids needing to learn right now, but to have the everyday moments where they are learning, because kids, especially little kids interact in their daily environments is learning. And so for kids to know that they're safe, know that they're cared for, and to minimize exposure to just like endless news on television. It's just at a certain age, it's not okay for kids to just sit in front of the television and watch news cycles. And so for kids to have an understanding of what's happening and the fact that we're staying at home so that we can be healthy, that we can help our neighbors be healthy, that we can help grandma and grandpa be healthy, all of those things, and to create normalcy and routine is really important. And it's tough because parents have anxiety right now, but to the extent that that anxiety is not transmitted to young children, it's really important.
Yeah, that's great. Katie, how are you dealing with talking about the disruption in your classes?
Sure. So with my kindergarten ESL students, we are constantly checking in with one another. We are either video chatting, we are sending messages through Seesaw. We are just staying in contact and in communication with parents and with students, letting them know that, you know, I'm here. How are you feeling today? Why are you feeling that way? Let's draw a picture about it. Let's talk about it. So just letting the students not only see me, but also hear me, and just kind of working together on different learning tasks to get through this time.
Yeah, yeah. And just a quick follow-up, how would you say kids what are their reactions? What are they kind of feeling? What's the range of emotions you're getting?
I think, you know, at first it was definitely an adjustment and a transition for students to all of a sudden be completing their learning tasks at home, if it's with an older sibling, if it's with a parent. But then also all of a sudden seeing me, their teacher, on their parent's phone or on their iPad, and just communicating that way instead of face-to-face and physically every day. That was an adjustment.
Yeah, that's great. So let's talk a little bit about what appropriate work might be for young kids. Gail, I want to start with you. I know some of your work focuses on screen time and the debate around that. So what might work look like for kids that are, 7 and younger?
Thank you for that great question, Stephen. I think it's really important to begin with thinking about access and equity before we even answer that question, which is not all families have access, or they may have a phone or two, but have more than one child needing access. So I think we need to manage expectations and provide choices. The ISTE ELN, the Early Learning Network of ISTE, has been having a series of webinars, and I'll put a link in the chat in a few minutes. But those are focused a lot on those kinds of things. And there have been some discussions about offering choice so that families and caregivers and children can make choices about how they practice or learn some of the content and the things that they're learning from home. And I think that's an important part of this balancing and getting it right for children. I think it's also important to say there are times when the adults in the home need to have quiet, and sometimes that's okay for screen time, for passive screen time. But the learning part of the equation should be much more active than that.
Yeah. Rhian, is there any guidance that you're providing on similar issues?
Yeah, so again, I think the situation we're in right now simply amplifies guidance we have given previously. So we have a joint position statement with the Fred Rogers Center on technology and young children, and a lot of that's on our website. It's on the Fred Rogers Center website, and I mean it is no different than in a crisis like this, in that technology can't be painted with the same brush, and there's different types of technology, and it's for different purposes. So for example, there's a lot of great examples of digital learning where you take cameras out to photograph different spots in your environment for science and education and documentation on the work that you're doing. And there are opportunities for serve and return relationships are really important. And right now, the way in this situation, the way we have serve and return relationships in many instances is doing what we're doing right now, talking to each other through a screen. That said, anything that is where technology is used to enhance the human condition, that works well. And we have to think about it that way. As Gail said, parents are going to need some downtime. And so I urge parents to not put too much pressure on themselves. And I think around learning right now with young kids, because they're learning in everyday experiences. I have teenagers, but we just made grilled cheese sandwiches together. As long as we're talking and interacting while we're doing that, and we're spreading butter and we're counting how much cheese we're putting on. I mean, those are things that you learn. If you're folding laundry with your kids, those are gross motor skills that are being taken into account. And so there are opportunities to learn with technology, but it is a tool as are crayons and blocks and watercolors. And so we need to just continue to think about that, even in this environment.
Yeah. Any follow-up to that, Gail and Katie?
I agree. I think as a teacher, I've been trying to be very purposeful of the lessons and activities I send out to my students. They're not just consuming through the digital device, they're creating, and that might be creating with the family member and kind of co-engaging in the digital device. So it might be create a scene with your Barbie dolls, take a picture and tell me about what they're doing, or let's go on a scavenger hunt, take pictures of something blue, something bumpy, something that's a square shape. Send your pictures to me and talk about them. I think that the great thing is that our digital devices do allow for the use of all the language domains, which is really important in creating those academic skills for our young learners. They can read, they can write, they can speak, they can listen, all within one task. And then I'm able to receive that through platforms like Seesaw. And just like we talked about, using the resources we have at home to continue the learning. If it's using toys, the camera, but also practicing those foundational and fundamental pencil and paper skills, but then also being able to share those with me as their teacher digitally.
I'd like to add, if I can, I think that the technology also provides support, provide support to families so that they can support their children. So the ability to, on paper, on the packets that are sent home or those kinds of things, to have a QR code that goes to audio instructions for our not literate families, or audio instructions in another language for families who struggle to read and write. Those kinds of bridges can be really purposeful too. And I think while we may not all be there yet, I think that that's something that we can be harnessing technology to do better, to make that bridge from school and home a little bit stronger.
Yeah, that's great. So we're getting a lot of questions about Zoom and other similar conferencing platforms for students younger than 13. Rhian, can I just check in with you about your thoughts on, I know teachers want to be reaching their students, in some sort of video format, is Zoom and platforms like that the best to be using?
So, I don't know that I'm the right person to answer from a technology perspective, whether or not they are. I think to the extent that for children younger than 13, whether it's Zoom or GoToMeeting or other conferencing type devices, I think it works. I know some teachers are using Blackboard, and I've seen them all work. I think it's important that, particularly for young kids under 13, that it's supervised, that it's led by a teacher or an adult or a parent. I know for our younger kids here, we've put together Zoom meetings with their friends, and we have supervised those meetings. But they've been great experiences. They've been really good experiences. And I do think, to the extent that school districts are really doing a yeoman's job to, in really extraordinary circumstances, transition into distance learning, to be able to use those platforms is really important. And so I've seen examples of them used well. I would not I'd be cautionary in saying kids should just use them without adult supervision the younger they are.
Yeah, yeah. Gail, can I check in with you on that?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
Can I check in with you on that question of Zoom and video conferencing platforms?
Well, I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that that whole idea of being synchronous and asynchronous is really important in families and homes, and that being able to do those off schedule. So I know that a lot of educators are reaching out to families via phone calls or video calls to get that in-person like connection, and also doing some very small groups as well as whole class stuff. But we know that everybody trying to get on at the same time is problematic for a whole lot of reasons, and presumptive perhaps for us walking into it's like walking into their home without ringing the doorbell. So I think that we have to be kind of cautious. However, I will say that some of the most powerful learning happens when children are explaining their learning to each other, and we need to leave those doors open as well. But I agree completely that this should be adult run and adult monitored.
Yeah, yeah. So Katie, you mentioned Seesaw. What are some of the other tools that you're kind of been using?
So I have used, really I've used Seesaw as kind of the platform to roll out my lessons to my students. I've used other methods of communication, especially when communicating with the parents, such as Google Voice. And I enjoy creating a lot of digital writing prompts or guides for students to either watch on their iPad and then guide them in creating a pencil to paper product. For that, I use things such as Bunsy, Keynote, Pages, all sorts of different things. Anything that will kind of spark creativity and ignite the engagement to get students excited about creating a pencil to paper task. They're usually then asked to take a picture of their work and then record themselves talking about it or reading it and send it back to me through Seesaw. Yeah,
yeah. So we had a question in the Q&A from Laura about creating audio instructions and how you're using audio. Katie, can you speak to that?
Sure. So I think especially with our young learners, I think adding the audio instructions is really important if it's a a screencast or just any way that you can model or guide students through the digital tasks that they need to complete or the instructions, to kind of create that model and that guide of what you need to do. Now it's your turn, try it. Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to ask about how much can we really expect from young learners? Is there a ratio or any kind of guidelines on how much work or time we can be reasonably expecting from them? I don't know, Rhian, if your organization has any guidance on that.
We have not put any specific guidance out on kind of time in the day. And I think for NACCE, it's birth through age 8. So obviously that's a age range that is incredibly diverse. And so I'm hesitant to suggest anything. I think Katie would probably be able to answer better for K3. For the little ones, again, it can be this interactive experience throughout the day. And so it's harder to separate out because for toddlers and preschoolers, it's not desk time, it's not sitting. So it's, in 15-minute intervals, it's in 20-minute intervals, it's having a conversation while you're taking the toddler to the bathroom, to the restroom, and so it's this very kind of organic experience for young kids when they're learning. And that's true when they're in childcare or if they're in preschool programs where it's done well. And I think, the other thing about early learning, so thinking birth to 5 now, is I think Gail mentioned it's as much about children interacting and having experiences with each other and solving problems than it is kind of a one-way form of instruction. And so, for children who are maybe only siblings or are only children, don't have siblings, and can't run and play down the street, I think that's the hardest right now, is that children are really isolated and part of their learning experience is with other kids. And so to the extent that you can use technology devices, as Katie has described, to do group learning and have children interact with each other, I think it's really, really important, because those interactions, and I know you said next week you're going to talk about social emotional learning, but I would say in all the domains of development for young children, in a moment like this where there is high anxiety and there's this really unusual behavior that they're seeing and experiencing and having to live through, that I would prioritize social emotional experiences and comfort more than anything, quite frankly. So the extent that, you know, we're more focused on that and creating those experiences, I think. And so those are deep connections, they're talking, they're, as Katie said, you know, asking questions, getting kids to express their emotions, to draw and to write their emotions. I would put that at the top of the list during a situation, a public health crisis like the one we're in now.
Yeah, yeah. Gail, can I follow up with you that question, but also can we, you know, engineer the learning so that we're building, you know, strong family connections?
There's a great opportunity for lots of things that maybe aren't on top of the list yet. Many teachers were forced in a sense to leave their classrooms without even taking anything with them. There are schools that teachers haven't been allowed back in and are teaching from home. And there's a lot of pressures, a lot of competing pressures. And I think there's this need to deal with the personal needs first, like Rhian had said, you know, which is we have to start with Maslow's needs, you know, first make sure people are fed both physically and emotionally, spiritually, or whatever connections. But then after that, there's opportunities for other things. There's this wonderful opportunity to make sure what we model, whether it's asynchronous or synchronous, models for parents good behaviors as teachers, as learning partners. And that, like reading a book to your class, there's now great legal guidelines online to help you know when that's appropriate as a teacher. But that how you read it and how you interact, even though the children aren't right with you, models some really powerful behaviors for families to then be able to replicate, because they don't get to see us teaching in our classrooms. We close the door, they leave, and we do these wonderful behaviors. So I think there's this other need that at some point will come and become easier, which is to recognize that when we're teaching through video or through the words we choose, we'll be giving parents and families and caregivers opportunities to learn from us as well. And sometimes we can even label those behaviors as we're doing it and not distract from the action with the children. So I think that's another piece which may come to the forefront as this continues, since many states have now said schools will not reopen until September or August. There's a lot of time here to build to those kinds of things. As far as for number of minutes or how long children should be learning, they should be learning to the best of their ability whenever they can. And I don't think timelines are the key. I think it's getting them interested, harnessing their interests, and adapting to them. The things we always try to do in the classroom, but allowing that room at home as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Katie, what are kind of the expectations in your classroom that you would say parents are aware of that their kids are responsible for?
Sure. So we have been kind of rolling out our lessons and our activities through choice boards, allowing students to complete the activities when the time is right. If they need the help of a parent or an older sibling, you know, it doesn't have to be done that day. It can be done by the end of the week. I think also giving students the choice of different activities to complete really helps with the engagement and the motivation to complete the activities. To follow up on what Gail said, I love that this time has allowed us to record ourselves reading a read aloud story, but then also make that story personalized and relevant. So if we are, let's say, we've read the story Knuffle Bunny. Now students are able to take a picture of their special stuffed animal at home to share with the rest of the class. So they're able to bring in kind of personalized items within their home to connect the learning. And I think, you know, as we know, when students have a personalized connection to the learning, they're more engaged and motivated to learn, which has been a really, really neat, kind of interesting thing to kind of come out of all that.
Yeah, Yeah, we did have a question in the Q&A about how you're assessing the speaking abilities of your ESL students.
Sure. So the way I would assess if I was in the classroom. So I do also, the things I roll out to my students are things that I would expect them to be able to complete and do within my classroom. I do also have on my choice board some activities that are STEM activities, that are activities that require more family engagement to create something using the things you have at home. If it's creating a bed for Goldilocks, or writing down a recipe for a soup that you and your mom make, like Goldilocks' porridge that she eats, and let's do a cooking video with your mom and show me your video. But to assess the speaking ability, I just like I would in the regular classroom, I have rubrics that I listen to students' voice recordings, and then I use my rubrics or my assessments to scoring and assess the learning.
Yeah. So assessment is something that comes up quite a bit. I know teachers have a lot of questions about that. Rhian, have you heard about that from any educators? And what are the big pressing concerns about assessment? Is this even something that we should be thinking of when you just said a few minutes ago that social emotional needs really are paramount? You're on mute, Rhian, by the way.
Sorry, my kids were yelling in the background. So I'd say a couple things about it. First off, again, with young children, even through third grade, assessment often occurs through observation and through it is less a kind of a sit down moment where you have them do an exam or something like that. So by nature, it's more difficult to assess children when you're not in the same room that they are. So I think it does put some pressure on assessment. We have not come out with specific guidance on assessment at this point, but what I would say is that most teachers are spending the bulk of their time kind of reorienting to this environment and focusing their attention on individual learning, on group learning, on feedback and interaction with parents, making sure parents are set up and feeling comfortable about all of this. And that's in the context of kids who are in schools, who are in Head Start, who are in pre-K programs. The vast majority of early childhood education can't even contemplate assessment right now because the childcare system has shut down, in essence. And so in that regard, schools and Head Start are in the enviable, preschools are in the enviable position to be really considering ongoing instruction right now. Most children are not in those settings, birth to 5. They're in private family childcare. They're in church childcare or synagogue childcare or for-profit childcare, and that system has been decimated in this crisis. And so the vast majority of that workforce has been laid off and is not working right now. So it would be, there's a segment of our population that can actually focus on assessment and be thinking about that. But the vast majority of folks in early childhood education are trying to survive right now, quite frankly.
Yeah. Gail, any thoughts on how we can think about this creatively?
Well, there's always thoughts. I think it's really important to continue to recognize first that this is the first 3 weeks of school or the first 2 weeks of school. We don't do much assessment during those weeks of school. We do a lot of observation and encouragement and working on establishing routines and acceptable behaviors. And that's where we are right now in those who are doing online schooling. I think it is also important, though, to recognize what Rhian just said, which is a lot of families aren't in this situation, and to continue to try to also reach out to them. But if you're a classroom teacher and you have your own family and all these other things, this isn't the time to ask them to do more. So that's why we're trying to do more workshops and webinars that are family friendly as well as teacher friendly. And others are trying to provide resources. I put a resource in the chat from Common Sense Media that has links for families. I think that we need to continue to share all the goodness that happens in formal education settings so that informal education settings can survive.
Yeah. So I have a few questions. I'm going to get everyone's input on, students that are, 5, 6 years old, they or even younger may still be, developing their fine motor skills. And that's something that, obviously tactile work can help with more than technology. So I wanted to touch in with you on that subject. I guess we'll start with you, Katie. What are your thoughts about, using tactile work, away from screens and computers?
Well, that's where I think it's important to create those kind of blended learning, flip learning activities where it's if students listen to my instructions and then go actually do something that's tactile. So if it's, I want you to go build something with your blocks and then take a picture and show it to me. So I think we still are able to have students practicing those fine motor skills, those tactile skills. They're just using the resources and things they have within their home instead of what's found in our classroom. So I don't think that learning, I think it still continues.
Yeah. Any interesting ideas? So using things around the home for projects, or how does that look?
Yes, so using toys, going out and using things in nature, using food in the pantry. I think, sometimes our students might not have a lot at home, but they do have things that they can use to continue that learning. One thing that has helped me is at the beginning of the school year, I completed home visits with my students. So at this point, I was able to kind of show them how to use some of those things within the home to continue the learning. So fortunately for some of my students, they already had kind of a background knowledge of how to use some of those things, which has been very helpful. Yeah.
Rhian, can I just touch in with you on, a similar question about, activities and kind of getting parents and families involved in specific projects?
Yes, and I want to reinforce a point that Gail made around the silver lining in this is an opportunity for early educators to connect directly with parents and be a partner with them and reinforce their value as being able to do this at home and with the support of early childhood educators. And for little kids, there's so many just items that you have in your house. In fact, we started to kind of put some resources together with NACI and just really realized how many everyday things you don't have to go to the store and buy in order to have great learning experiences. Many things in the kitchen. And it could be as simple as measuring water and, measuring solids and liquids. It could be having if you have different bags of pasta, sorting based on shape and size and color. Buttons, things you can do with buttons in the house, whether you're threading them, depending on the age of the child, but threading them or sorting them or characterizing them. Definitely blocks. Blocks are always a go-to. We always talk about, STEM education and early learning, where you stack blocks at different heights and start to talk about how quickly or slowly, a marble rolls down a ramp. That's early physics. And as simple as a game, or, with a little bit older kids, getting them to work together to build a city with blocks. I mentioned folding laundry because a lot of parents, I think, feel pressure. Again, they're pulled in many directions right now because they're parents, they're having to work full time at home, they're having to manage their house. And so there's so many things that you can do to integrate kids in those activities. Let's say you have to go out and pull weeds. Kids come with you and you pull weeds and you talk about it and you look at the gross stuff under the soil and what all the roots are. Or again, you're folding laundry, you can count how many folds you're making when you're folding the sleeves over top of each other. So it is such it's in a what's the positive in all of this? It's such a great time for early childhood educators to reinforce parents have got this, like they can do this. And we know it's stressful. We're here for you. And you don't have to go buy stuff. There's so much you can do in your house to promote learning for young kids.
Just piggyback on that, Stephen.
Yeah.
In addition, don't forget about cultural things or like finger play and jump rope rhymes and those things that you can do with absolutely nothing but your fingers. And that families have those traditions that could be passed on now and even shared beyond if that's part of your routine in your online schooling or your connections. So another one is the kinds of bread. Every culture has a kind of bread item, and to talk about or share about that, or if it's something someone's making at home, and that we should open the door to those opportunities. And then you need a cell phone and a connection to share that back out, or you can, in a voice call with a teacher, talk about that. But I think those kinds of traditions and home things don't require a lot of anything tangible, really, beyond what they normally do or might have. So I think that's a really important consideration.
Yeah, that's great. So we're getting a number of questions about, I know it's very early, but next year, how this will impact the learning for next year. Will that necessitate a lot of review? How might that look? Rhian, can we start with you?
Oh, I have to get my head around next year. So I would say our biggest concern right now is if, in order for the economy to be ready to roll when we start to lift the stay-at-home requirements, 70% of childcare is closed right now, and so there's going to be a rehiring process. There's going to be a lot of childcare we hear that's closed permanently because the economics are such that they can't reopen. And so I think there is going to be, and if we don't pay attention to federal funding that is coming for childcare and getting additional federal funding, it is going to be really hard for families to get back on their feet and be able to go to work without that economic stability of childcare. And so that is front on our minds right now. Is, again, we've decimated a system. And again, I think that's a place where public schools, they are closed now. It is a transition and it's difficult, but we know the funding hasn't gone away. They're going to reopen, and Head Start's going to reopen. I do think that this kind of building the plane while flying it that we've had to do as a sector around distance learning and education, I am hopeful that it'll have a positive long-term impact on the relationship between families and early childhood educators, on the community connections that we build. I think, as Gail said, you're letting people into this very personal space just by having video in your house. And I hope that we use that to establish and recreate the strong family connections for educators to understand the cultural values that families are bringing to a classroom. I'm hopeful about that piece. I do hope that, conversely, that this doesn't upend what we know fundamentally to be true about young kids and learning, that they need to be together, that they need to have physical contact and hug each other and learn together, and that educators need to be in spaces with young kids to maximize their learning experiences. So I really hope that doesn't change, because that is the basic science of early learning, and it's essential.
Yeah. Any guidance, Katie, from your district, or what you're thinking about moving forward? Maybe not next year, but going forward in the next couple months.
I think to just, try and continue to do what we're doing. Just checking in with families and students throughout the week. And I will say this time has enabled me to kind of, even though you may have a class of 20 students, you are able to almost work with them on an individual basis, really giving them feedback to when they submit assignments. Telling them to maybe try it another way next time, or giving them that individualized and personalized feedback that sometimes in a big classroom we're not able to give them. So I do feel like this has given me a lot of insight on the learning of each of my students and their individual needs.
Yeah, that's great. So we had a question in the Q&A for you, Gail. Are there any resources that you would recommend schools pass on to parents about managing screen time in a healthy way? I mean, where would you start to answer this question for parents?
Well, first, I think the simplest piece is guidance, not another link, but to remind parents that all children, especially the young ones, need to be doing active and creative learning, not just consuming on any device. That it's not sitting and passively watching a video, but it's watching it with someone else when possible, or doing something with what they're seeing, talking about it, drawing a picture, extending the story, all those kinds of things. So moving to more active and creative uses of whatever technology or whatever tools they're using, even if it's just the camera. I think the other thing to think about is kind of that in schools, Dr. Marina Bears talks a lot about playground uses and playpen, and that a playpen is where you put your child where they have limited choices, but they're safe, and you leave them there for a short period of time to learn to be bored or learn to play on their own, but to give the adults usually a moment to do something else. That's a valid use of technology. It's a valid use of a playpen, but we don't want any children to grow up with only playpen, only using technology with constraints and limited adult or other interaction. A playground is designed for children. It has some safety built in. It has adult supervision. People don't usually just drop their kid off the playground and drive away. So we still have that adult supervision and adult interaction, but we have a little more flexibility in how they use the things in the playground, whether the swing is a launch or it's an airplane or it's a boat on a sea is for the child to decide. And I think that if we can help families and teachers think about playpens and playgrounds in the kinds of activities, whether they're technology or not, that we give some room for kids to expand, we give some room for kids to deal with boredom, and we give parents and families and caregivers room for that as well. So that would be one of the things I think we should think about. I think the other thing, going back to what you were talking about before, what happens next year or what happens in the future, I think one of the big ahas will be and it's already been talked about a lot online, is realizing that it works better when we've already used the tools when we are together, and that we shouldn't be waiting until there's a catastrophe or a pandemic or a problem to introduce tools that we know have power, that we can use those tools when we're with our students and our children and with the families before we have to use them. So I think that is one of the positive changes that may come out of this, is looking at technology and other tools differently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm getting the sense from you, Gail, that it's, instead of sending just another link, it's helpful to hear directly from the teacher. Yeah.
Yes. And I think we need the teachers want to know from the people who are teaching them or their supervisors or their systems what the message needs to be. And the systems are still busy trying to get up and running. It's still the first 2 weeks of school. And these are all new policies and all new focus for most schools, most services. So I think patience and grace are important, but I think what we need to do is be noting and documenting what we need to do next time and what those messages and tools and resources need to be.
Yeah. Katie, how has that looked for you, responses to the guidance that you're putting out? Would you agree with Gail that you find parents are receptive?
I do, and I agree with Gail in that a lot of the tasks that I try to create for my students are very open-ended to allow them to be creative with the task, and I'm very I guess throughout the beginning of the school year, my students in my classroom were very comfortable using our digital devices, using iPads. They weren't on the iPads all the time in my classroom, but I was very purposeful in creating center activities that were blended learning activities, where students might use the iPad to guide or model or show them how to complete the task if it was an actual physical, something they needed to do. So when they took their iPad home to begin our distance learning journey, they were familiar with the functions, how to use it. A lot of times, as we know, sometimes our young students, our young learners know more than the parents do on how to use the devices. So it was very helpful for me that the students went into this distance learning journey comfortable with the device and how to use some of the programs. So when I had a challenge or an open-ended task for them, they knew how to use the camera, hold the iPad to take a picture, how to record a video, which is great because I want them completing the task. It's not a task for their parent to do. It's some of them might be STEM or collaborative activities, but they're also tasks for the students to show what they know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to go back to something that you said, Rhian, is that this isn't like an ideal, this isn't the ideal. The ideal is that you have students and teachers in the same place interacting. We may get to a point where, teachers are comfortable enough with remote learning that they can start to cover some new concepts. Do you think that we're going to get there in the next few weeks, the next few months, and what will that look like when they have to cover material that they haven't covered in a face-to-face setting?
Yeah, so overall I have a high degree of confidence in early childhood educators and their ability to adapt. I mean, you listen to Katie, like their ability to adapt and move in a dynamic situation. And can you communicate concepts virtually? Absolutely. And it takes some sophistication, as Katie's talking about. It's, let's talk about this and then go do it and bring it back and then let's talk about it again. And so you're modeling kind of the same concepts that you do in person. And so I absolutely, children will learn in the next 3 months. They will learn, and schools will adapt, and some are better prepared than others, I think. So yeah, I am confident that learning will continue to happen. That said, again, for young children, this is early childhood education. It serves several purposes. It is first and foremost to keep kids safe while their parents work, quite frankly. I mean, you see how even K12 education serves in that dual role. I mean, it is purposed to be a learning environment for kids, but when schools close, parents have some huge issues related to how they work. And so both K12 education and early childhood education serve in this dual role of keeping kids safe while their parents work and creating these fabulous learning environments that can't be rebuilt online. That is not something that you can just say, oh, now we're going to do it online. So for multiple reasons, for a child's learning and development, for the support of the economy, quite frankly, and for the parents' ability to work and kids' ability to be safe, for all those reasons, it is important that we get back to a version of what we've been doing.
Yeah, that's great. So I wanted to, so we're getting a couple questions about engagement, specifically families that aren't as engaged as other families. Are there any strategies, Katie, that you've been employing to kind of boost engagement?
Well, I think that can definitely be a challenge sometimes if parents are working, if students don't have family members at home or older siblings to help them with tasks if they need some help. So I think it's important to those that do complete tasks or share their work to share it with the whole class, to show others, look what Miguel did, or look what he found at home, or look what Lisa created with her toys. Isn't this great? What can you do now? And I think just also creating that constant communication with students and giving them that authentic audience, knowing that I'm going to submit this picture or this video recording and Mrs. Gardner's going to see it and she's going to give me feedback or tell me if she likes it or what I can do better for next time. So knowing that when they do the work, it is being viewed, it is being monitored and assessed, and I will give feedback to let them know that I appreciate the learning that they're doing at home. Yeah.
Gail, any thoughts on engagement and feedback?
I think Katie's made some really good points. There are a couple others, which is some teachers are finding that a big majority of their students are participating at some level, which is great. And so once they are participating at some level, they're doing things like reading a chapter book and stopping at cliffhanger, and you have to come back the next day to hear the next piece. So there's a reason to come back to the real time whenever that's possible. But I think the other part is really about the few who aren't participating. It's the making a real phone call using a Google number or whatever you want to use to protect your own mobile numbers or home numbers, but reaching out to those families to make sure they're okay and that the child still feels involved and incorporated in what's going on.
Yeah, that's great. So I had another question to pose to the three of you, which is about peer-to-peer interactions. How can we really facilitate those, and how much importance should schools and teachers be putting on having students kind of communicate with each other? Rhian, can we start with you?
Yes. I think peer-to-peer interactions are really important, and to the extent that the technology exists and there's equity in how the technology exists, I think facilitating that is really important. I know by one example, the district we're in here in Virginia, that as the district has planned out the virtual day, there are chunks of the day using different technologies where students are interacting with each other. It's designed that way for them to have peer-to-peer learning. And again, there is technology with adult supervision that can do that. You can use Zoom to create chat rooms, so that there's small group interaction and that sort of thing. So I think for students who are school age, who are kindergarten above, I think there are great ways for early childhood educators, for teachers to facilitate that learning. For young children, birth to 5, it's trickier. I mean, how do you recreate a play date in the park? And so in some ways you have to rely on adult-child interactions, but to the extent that families are equipped to create those same kind of learning opportunities, I mentioned we've set up some Zoom calls for my daughter, to the extent that parents can help do what they would do in a mommy and me, or the grandma taking the children to the library reading session, to the extent that parents have the time and are motivated to recreate those environments, you absolutely could do that using technology. And so I think we just have to be really careful about equity issues, because there are many, many, many families in incredibly vulnerable circumstances, and this has made their circumstances more vulnerable. And so the expectations, we just need to manage, I think, the expectations we put on parents, and kind of simple messages around, like, don't overdo this. Like, don't be too hard on yourself. You can extend this experience in everyday moments. I think to balance that is really important.
Yeah. Is that reasonable? Is this a reasonable expectation or request? Gail, can I throw that to you?
To find and encourage ways for children to be able to interact with each other?
Yes.
I think it's reasonable, but it needs, as Rhian said, to be with caution. So there are some other tools that haven't been mentioned, like Padlet. Padlet is online, and you can post things. I have a friend, I can't share it with you because she's kept it private appropriately, but she's asking the 6-year-olds in her care as a teacher, and she posts a squiggle on Padlet, and then they're to guess what she started drawing, and they all put in their guesses, and they can react to each other's guesses. And then in the end, she shows her finished drawing. So it's a very simple interaction, and that interaction can be text, it can be audio, it can be an image, and that's all decided by the end user. So the child and the child's family can decide how they respond, if they respond at all. And she has a couple of students in her class who don't respond, who she calls, and she records the snippet on her phone of what they have to say, and she posts it for them with parents' permission. So those children are still participating as well. So they're at least seeing each other's actions and reactions. And it's not in real time, and a teacher can approve all those before they go public, so that there's some control over nobody gets anything inappropriate posted. So I think that there's some imagination. I know that there are lots of families that are reaching out to do these things as well. In our neighborhood here in the south side of Houston, we did a bear hunt. Everybody put stuffed bears in their neighborhood, and the kids drove through the neighborhood in cars with their parents looking for the bears. And they're doing an Easter egg hunt now where people are putting paper Easter eggs or plastic Easter eggs out in their yards, and children are driving by and counting Easter eggs. So those are community efforts that did not start from schools, and I think we can encourage those kinds of things. I saw one online today where they were putting out a stuffed animal with information about what that animal's like in the real world, and so students could go on a safari. So those are all in the safety of their homes or in their cars. I think those are kind of clever. Those didn't come from us educators. Those came from families, and we should harness those as well.
Yeah, yeah. Katie, what does that look like among your students now, and do you have plans for the future?
Sure. So I think now we really need to kind of try and think creatively about ways our students can engage with each other and interact with each other. Some digital platforms and digital tools do have a collaborative feature where students can collaborate on the same digital product. But I have seen, people that Zoom with their pre-K classes, I think it's important to just start simple. If it's just Zooming together and singing a song, or doing a quick check-in, morning meeting type thing. How are you feeling? What are you doing today? What did you have for breakfast? Just very simple to let students see one another in a positive manner. I think you can also collaborate on a digital tool or a digital product if it doesn't have a collaborative feature, such as I might send out a scene or a picture and ask one student to draw something on that picture using an annotation feature, such as, can you draw a flower? And then I'll take that picture that they send back to me with their drawing, and I'll send it to another student and say, can you draw on my picture a bird? And then they'll send me that picture and I'll send it to another student. So by the time everybody gets our picture, everybody's drawn something to create a photo together, a drawing together. We've also created digital books together where students will be in charge of creating their own page and picture, and then I'll put them back together and create a digital book that our whole class has collaborated on, and we can share together, even though we're physically not there in the classroom doing it together.
Yeah, that's great. Rhian, any last words on keeping up morale, personal well-being, emotional learning that you can share before we wrap?
Yes. So two things. First is, I would say what we've said to our team at NACCE, which is in a public health crisis like this, your personal health and well-being, your family's health and well-being is absolutely the most critical thing. And I think Gail used the notion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. That's essential. And we recognize that a lot of people are now caregivers, or they're responsible for other people, or they're worried, or they're anxiety ridden, and we can't ignore that. And that has to be attended to and acknowledged, and we need to keep bringing it up. Bringing it up one time isn't enough. And so making sure that we are as a field emotionally ready to be our best requires us to be kind and generous with each other in time to talk about our emotional well-being. So that's true for teachers, it's true for families, and it's true for young children. That said, I think we have to both acknowledge the gravity of the situation and the severity of it, and also say, it's moments like this that the greatest innovation can come, and opportunities to rethink how we do things, and to imagine what could be. I'm just even like listening to Katie and Gail talk about what could be is inspiring to me. And I think it challenges us to be our best selves. And so I would both say, take care of yourself and push yourself to be innovative in this moment that completely upends our world.
Yeah, no, that's a great note to end on. With that, a big thanks to our webinar panelists, Rhian Evans-Allvin, Katie Gardner, and Gail Lovely. Once again, thank you for lending your time and your insights. Again, I'm Stephen Noonoo, the K12 editor here at EdSurge, and we provide the latest resources and news about how technology is shaping the ways we learn and teach. Sign up for our free newsletters or find out more resources at edsurge.com. I'm going to put a link to a quick survey about future webinar topics in the chat. If you could take that, it should only take 1 minute. There's really only one question. Would love to hear about what you want to hear about for future webinars. And to hear more webinars, go to edsurge.com/e/webinars. You'll be getting an email next week with the chat transcript and a link to the recap that I'm going to do with some highlights from this conversation, as well as the full recording. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a great afternoon. Really appreciate it. Take care.